Welcome to Educate to Self-Regulate, a podcast for educational leaders, teachers, and students, where in less than 20 minutes, we unpack educational research to support you and your students to become better learners. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Educate to Self-Regulate. I'm joined again by the lovely Rebecca Birch, who agreed to hang around and do another episode with me. So thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks for having me again.
Thank you. And nice to have you spending a little bit more time with our listeners and with me, and for us to learn a little bit more about the Smart Study program. Because in the last episode, Rebecca, you were telling us a little bit about the Smart Study program that's been happening at Queenwood, and a little bit about the teaching approaches and the strategies that were being taught in classrooms or in sessions, and hopefully very useful to the teachers in our audience. We thought we'd go a little bit deeper in this episode and dig further into the Smart Study program. So we might get straight into it just to make sure, because I feel like there's so much in this program.
Yeah.
That we can sort of continue on from. Now, from the leadership lens, if I was a school leader who was wanting to lead a self-regulated learning initiative in a school, where do we even start with something like this?
It's a really good question. And I have people within my school come to me with ideas for whole school projects all the time. And I think the really key thing for leaders is to slow down first of all, and make sure the problem is what you think it is. So that's what I always say is, what is the evidence that you have that this is a problem in your school? Because I think with whole school projects too, the temptation can be that something sounds effective, it sounds good, it sounds beneficial. But just checking that that is suited to your student cohort and your teachers before you lift a finger is a really judicious thing to do. Schools have a lot of competing priorities. You can only have so many whole school projects running at a time. And I would argue that a focus on one thing at a time is probably optimal. I know it's highly unrealistic that the schools would actually do that, but a lot of really successful schools, that's what they do, is that they look at what the actual problems are and they really focus on embedding one thing at a time. So this involves a lot of teacher upskilling. It involves time. It involves resources. So I'd say think very carefully about the school's capacity, the time, the space, and whether there's a need. Now, having said that, I think that there is a need for this, just on a general basic level.
And that seems to be an obvious choice for you based on the data that you were collecting, or at least the pattern of academic stress that you were observing in your students. Was there other data that you were using to actually identify self-regulated learning as a focus?
No, but I think schools have lists of students who present with wellbeing issues, and you can quantify that. Like, if you've got a big list or a small list. And so I think there's some really sort of obvious data to use. And then you have your sort of more qualitative anecdotal data, which is students are presenting with a very specific type of problem, and it's pointing in this particular direction. I think learning support units are not necessarily, ours is, but they're not always necessarily upskilled in how to develop independence. They're more potentially looking at how to give support in the moment rather than giving support that will have an impact later on or outside the classroom. So I think they're not necessarily geared to giving that kind of support. I think that can change. And I think when you've got a program like Smart Study, you can make sure that your diverse learning departments are the key people who are upskilled in those strategies, so that when a student presents to them, they can say, well, I know you did that in Smart Study, and so I know you can do it now. How about you show me what you learned? Things like that.
Activating transfer, isn't it? I think that's so important. So because this has been quite a long scale study, I suspect, Rebecca, you spent quite a bit of time designing and planning this. How long did that take, and how did you actually come up with this kind of design for the study?
Yeah, it took probably, I'd say 5 months. And I think we were early mover in this space. So there's a lot of schools now, they've seen the success of Smart Study, and there's a lot of schools implementing this kind of program. But because we're a first mover, it put us at sort of like a disadvantage, because it was open, so that we didn't really know what form it should take. So we had to do a lot of deep diving into the research as well to decide what are the strategies we would use. We also had a really great critical friend that I should mention, which is Churchy in Brisbane, who are at least a year ahead of us, maybe more. And they share all their resources. They've got like a sort of schools partnership where they give access to everything they ever created, including a whole OneNote with detailed lessons and things like that. Because of the nature of our project, we had to develop our own program. So if we were in a different position without a grant, we might have just jumped on Churchy's bandwagon and thought, okay, this is a really great solution, which it is. But we had to develop our own program, and we also had to bring our teachers along. We had quite a big team working on it. We had a team of about 9 teachers, including representatives from the wellbeing space involved in it. And we had to upskill everyone almost at the same time so the workload could be spread. Part of that process as well is, it's really interesting sort of lesson in change management for me, was that I initially gathered a lot of, expertise and research on the best strategies and how they work. Like with adult learners, it's really important not to dictate, but to respect their expertise and bring them along and allow them to present as experts as well. So what we did was assigned teachers a specific area of the research. So I would curate what that was going to be. And then I would ask teachers to nominate what is the area you want to really grab hold of and do a deep dive in. So that created a sense of ownership for those particular teachers, made them very enthusiastic and keen to deliver on those particular areas. So just for school leaders, I think that engagement of the team needs a lot of thought. If you have a dominant sort of 1 or 2 people implementing, it's really hard to get buy-in. Whereas if you've got multiple teachers in different departments, they kind of seed these ideas through their own departments, through their own areas, through their own practice. So having a big team it's a lot more work, but I think really worthwhile in the long run if it's a whole school project to get that buy-in from other teachers.
Yeah, I definitely advocate for with schools, when, designing teams, to think about having representatives from each of the departments or faculties, particularly for secondary schools, so that you do have some sort of ripple effect, and you've also got the context coming in. And so, if you've got a science teacher or 2 science teachers, well, they're bringing in, well, what does this mean? How does this transfer to science versus what does this mean for English versus what does this mean for maths? And so I agree with you. I think there's a lot of importance in thinking strategically about who is in the team,
Mm-hmm.
and how that knowledge may translate beyond the team as part of the longevity of an initiative like this. The one thing that you've made me think about, Rebecca, is actually I remember reading a study in, I think it was Theobald et al. 2021. And again, I can link that in for our listeners. But there was something in that article around the argument that study skills programs in their traditional sense, which is highly cognitive or focused on cognitive strategies, is not as effective as what they call metacognitive training, or more holistic kind of self-regulated learning training that brings in multiple other categories. Now, I know we spoke in the last episode about a number of cognitive strategies, but I know from the report that you had a bigger focus. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the focus there and perhaps the different areas, strands, components that made up that program?
Yeah, sure. So you can think of it as having 2 parts. So we had all the study strategies based on cognitive science, but you'll know from your work as well that there are a lot of socio-emotional capabilities as well involved in self-regulated learning. So a big part of our team were people that were involved in wellbeing. And as I was saying, our grant was really about it being a wellbeing project rather than purely an academic project. So we had a strand of strategies that they needed explicit teaching and modeling, but not to the same extent that you would have to explicitly teach a study strategy that's embedded in domain knowledge. So it's things like help seeking. You'd be surprised at how difficult it is, I guess, for a young person to write an email that's going to inspire someone to help them. Often they can be a bit abrupt, and I wouldn't say rude, but they need a bit of guidance around how to persuade an adult to be very enthusiastic about helping them. So writing a teacher email that's polite and concise and says exactly what they need. Things like their own motivation, so identifying their sources of motivation. What are the more constructive aspects of motivation, and what are the more, short-term aspects of motivation? So we know about extrinsic motivation is where they're performance oriented, and we know that doesn't sustain students. So we know that if they're more intrinsically motivated and think about things like mastery or mastery goals, that's the kind of motivation that's going to sustain them during the hard times. So making all that visible to them was important as well. What other kind of things did we do?
So it's all goal setting, and there was a metacognitive element that was coming in as well, which obviously is critical for self-regulated learning. So there was goal setting, and I think I saw in one of the tables self-reflection and self-evaluation or something like that as well.
Yeah. And in the year 11 and 12, we really ramped it up. So Dan Willingham's got a really good book. It's actually a good one for leaders as well, because he has pitched it at college level students, which is really our stage 6 students are getting up towards that sort of pointy end of their learning. And it's called Outsmart Your Brain, a section at the end of each chapter, which is for instructors. So it's all well and good that we can tell students to use these strategies, but how do we optimize our instruction so that they can actually be prompted or have those sort of experiences facilitated by the kind of instruction they're getting as well? So when we get up to stage 6, we do a sort of smaller program, and it's all about reviewing feedback, responding to feedback, reflecting in a lot of detail on their preparation. So things like Dan Willingham has almost like a procedure for reflecting on exam prep and whether they remembered things, but he really starts at the really big stuff that's going to bring you unstuck if you haven't done it. Like, for example, did you turn up for class? Now, if you didn't turn up for class, you didn't get the content, you're never going to memorize it, it's not in your notes, and that might be why you didn't pass that particular question. So it's a real, the procedure is good because it really starts with the big picture stuff that is a huge obstacle and then gets down into the nitty gritty as it goes along. So it's such a great way to open up even conversations about attendance. So like if you're reflecting on your exam and you've missed big chunks of learning because you like a 3-day weekend every week, then that's a good place to start. I mean, that's going to be, you can raise your ability to potentially learn something by 20% just by coming to school 5 days instead of 4. So I think even that is a part of, especially as you get older, like that's a big part of self-regulation. Can I get out of bed? Can I come to school? Can I choose to turn up to every class instead of going home early? Things like that. And I believe this is a problem in a lot of schools. So since COVID, student attendance is declining, and parents as well aren't always aware of how much their student is necessarily at school. So I think it's a good thing to almost like address in the metacognition space is you have goals, you have performance related goals, you have mastery goals, and you're not going to achieve them unless you start with these really big items like that. Paying attention is another big one that we're working on with year 7 at the moment, is that what are your major barriers to learning? Let's address those first.
Yes, yeah. I just want to recap. So just to make sure I've understood is what we've got here is we've got a strong motivation, a strong driver for why self-regulated learning was a focus, academic stress and other indicators that you used. You've got a very strategic approach to the way the team was selected and a much more holistic focus that actually expands upon what we would consider traditional study skills. So what I think is a contemporary view on sort of a more holistic approach to self-regulated learning, bringing in the emotional, the social, the motivational, the metacognitive components as part of a bigger study skills program. So I think that's really important. And then you went on this journey, which again, the leaders can do a bit of a deep dive if they read your report over 2 years that included multiple different data collection points, data analysis at different levels too, right? I'm keen to dig into the findings. What did you find? Maybe we could start with the students and then work from there. What were some of the key findings that emerged?
Yeah, I think one of the things I learned just as a researcher as well is it's really hard to shift subjective well-being, as a direct measure. So I think schools, there's a lot of pressure on us having that real direct impact on well-being, and I think that's a really difficult thing. So what we can do is shift indicators of well-being. So things like human need satisfaction. So we shifted this sort of combination of autonomy, support, and structure so that we delivered the content in a structured way, students felt competent, but then they were given the ability to be autonomous outside the classroom. So we see this real interaction between those two things. So we need both of those things in our human needs, but they actually interact in a really positive way in teaching and learning. So if we can provide the structure, that gives students a real choice in how they apply their learning. So if they don't have the competence, they can't actually go and make real choices afterwards. So we saw a big sort of interactive effect between those two things. Their motivation didn't really change that much. So I think that there's possibly an argument to be made that it's not really trait-based, but I think students have different motivations for different reasons. So we found that they have a high identified motivation, which means they're striving towards some kind of goal. So I think that's probably not a surprising finding in an independent girls' school that's a high-performing school, that the girls are able to be motivated by things that might be a couple of years away. I want to get into law, I want to get into medicine, or whatever that goal is for them, like nursing, whatever it is. And so they're able to sustain motivation from that. I would say we didn't see a big shift in intrinsic versus extrinsic, and we actually shared some of the research on the girls back with them. We said, this is you. This is how you present in regard to motivation. Intrinsic motivation for study was quite low, so we're able to have really good conversations about how there might not be an intrinsic pleasure in studying, and that's okay. So if you study and you're not saying, oh, I want to do this all weekend, that's a very normal thing. That's not unusual, because there's not an inherent joy like going to a picnic or something. So I think that's good to have those conversations with students around what kinds of things drive them. So knowing what we know about you, the idea of having some kind of mastery goal that's connected to your values or a long-term goal is the better strategy than wanting to beat your peer by 1 mark or whatever it is. It's also beating your peer, you have no control over that. The big surprise that we found was that students reported that they enjoyed school more over that time. So I think in terms of a proxy for the kinds of things we can control around student well-being, I think enjoyment of school is a big one. It means potentially they want to come to school more. They don't hate being there. They're more open to learning. And so that was a real surprise. And the biggest surprise was that the 4th time point for that was when they were about to step into their first formal exam. And so it was a real surprise to everyone on the team that we actually had a spike in that right before. There might have been other fun stuff going on at the school at the time, but we know that their first exam was not a sort of a detriment to their enjoyment of school. So that was probably one of the biggest surprises. And then we had upticks in things like, I think, persistence and planning. So little indicators of self-regulated learning and more competence in the particular skills over time.
Yes, which is what we would expect from a study, self-regulated learning kind of teaching approach over 2 years. Yeah. We would hope that we would see some of these changes, right? Because there's a lot of evidence to support these approaches in schools. So it's great to hear that you were seeing some of that in your own cohorts. You also saw changes at the teacher level, from what I read.
So the teachers basically came in with similar reflections to what I had about my own education around these strategies, was that they felt underprepared, they didn't really understand it. There were a lot of early comments about time being a factor, which I think is really valid. However, I do think that there's a false economy in not doing these things. All right. So what I think actually ends up happening, and I think we've seen this in the uptake of these strategies by teachers, is that if you have to reteach things all the time, if you have a class full of kids and you mention something that you did a month ago and you get 30 blank faces, that's a problem within your teaching. That is something that costs you time, because then you have to revise, you have to go over things. Whereas if you're embedding regular retrieval and also just creating more capable students who are able to communicate their needs, I think there's a time payoff in making that space for those strategies. The other thing is with the retrieval practice at the start of the lesson is often that time is, I don't want to say wasted, but it's sort of like less accounted for. Those first 10 minutes of the class can be very choppy and messy. There's a lot of role marking, people coming in late, things like that. Whereas if you have an activity on the board, everyone walks through, they're working. That means your lesson, even with latecomers who come in silence, starts absolutely on time for your explicit teaching. And you've got a very clean start, like you're marking your role while they're working in silence on their retrieval task. And so I think there are all these other benefits to starting with a sort of predictable, rigorous activity, which then in turn helps students remember things, gives you great formative assessment. So I think there's a positive feedback loop with that, where teachers see it working quite quickly and they're more inclined to keep doing those practices, because they serve a workload need in the long run. Not in the short term, maybe not, where you're learning to kind of embed a new habit in your teaching. But in the long term, definitely I think there's a workload flow on. And also, I guess, a sense of satisfaction when you see students are remembering things, and an ability to sort of address things on the spot. Especially stage 6 teachers, there can be a tendency to mark big chunks of work, and it's extremely time consuming. Whereas if you're doing a lot of formative assessment and reteaching to the whole class, you're not writing the same comment on 25 scripts,
Yes.
later on.
Yeah.
So I think that in the long term, there is a positive feedback loop associated with using those sorts of evidence-based practices.
Yeah, so what you have here, an increase in teacher confidence, and then you've got these quick wins happening for students and for teachers that hopefully is boosting self-efficacy. It's boosting motivation for the sustainment of this in terms of practice
Yeah.
and so on. It's so fascinating. There's so many more questions I could ask you, Rebecca, but I'm going to ask you one more question. If you could wave a magic wand and change anything in the way that you conducted that kind of few years with the SMART study, what would you change?
I'd probably change the domain-specific aspect of it. I would probably consult with middle leaders sooner than what we did. And I think middle leaders, they're like the engine room of the school. So even from a change management perspective, middle leaders have the ability to facilitate or block any project. If they're your allies, you've got a great program. If they're not, you can sort of forget about it. So I'd probably engage them sooner. I think as well, I would possibly spread the expertise sooner as well. I
Okay.
think there was a reliance on me as a content deliverer for some of the project, which I think gives you fidelity, but it doesn't give you sustainability, which is, I think, just as important, because you can improve things on the fly. Like if it's not perfect, you're going to get to teach it again. They're not really one and done strategies. Like we're in our third year now, rolling it out from 7 to 12. So I think that having that spread of expertise early, I'd probably spend even more time and maybe more purposefully around teacher ownership of a particular space and even like a discrete skill. And I think that can be satisfying for teachers as well, because you have this thing in motivation called role expansion, which is where you are given or you've got the opportunity to take extra responsibility that's not within your job title, but it's something you've chosen and is very satisfying. So it's a real good way to give teachers career enhancement and retain them by giving them real ownership and specialism of a particular space. Even if as a school, you can't afford to give everyone an allowance for participating in a particular project, but you can give them choice and leadership opportunities within a certain space.
I love that. It's a few things I want to highlight there. Middle leadership, 100%. And often schools that I work with, we start with middle leadership teams for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got this kind of distributed leadership, isn't it, that you were saying in
Mm-hmm.
terms of, or distributed ownership, really. Now, Rebecca, let's move into the on the reg segment. Do you have another strategy that you could share?
Well, it's something I'm exploring right now is when to do. Have you heard of cognitive offloading with ChatGPT?
No, I haven't, please. Tell me.
So cognitive offloading is where you put low-level tasks onto ChatGPT so that you can then focus on high-level thinking. But at the moment, I'm struggling with what to offload. I'm a novice in my PhD study, and so I'm not expert at actually deciding which tasks to offload and which ones that I should be doing by myself. So it's been a really interesting learning for me, because I've actually shared that with our Year 12 girls and said, if you are going to use it, be very careful about how you use it, because sometimes you really need to do that cognitive work. And so I guess the strategy for me is reflecting on how I'm using that particular tool and making sure that if I need to be doing that cognitive labor, that I'm the one doing it for my long-term learning. Otherwise, that whole long-term learning is gone unless I actually do something with that thinking.
Yes.
So it's interesting because I'm a novice in my area of study, but an expert in teaching. And so I'm able to step back a little bit and go, hang on, actually, I think I'm talking about myself here when I say don't rely on it too much.
Yeah, that makes sense. Nice. So cognitive offloading as a potential strategy. I'll share one as well, Rebecca. Actually, I mentioned in an earlier episode that I've been spending the first 30 minutes of my day writing because I'm writing my second book.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I learned from, it's actually I think it was the thesis whisperer Hugh Kearns, who
Mm-hmm.
shared this with me. He said, you park your car at the top of the hill. And so the idea here is that whenever you stop writing, after my 30-minute block, I stop writing, that you pop a note somewhere in your text in very large kind of letters. I make the font really, really big. And I'll say, right, continue writing subheadings for this chapter or whatever it is. And then I highlight it in bright pink. And so when I go back to my writing, I start from that bright pink instruction. And so his idea is that when he says park your car at the top of the hill, is that you don't want to have to go back to your writing and think, well, where was I at? What was I doing? You're at the
Yes,
top of the
that's
hill. If
true.
you've got that instruction, you can just roll straight into your writing. And
Yeah,
it
right.
worked wonders for my writing. I used it in my PhD as well. And so,
Mm.
it's just a little writing, self-regulated learning strategy that helps me process and get my thoughts down on paper.
Yeah, because what you're talking about there too a little bit is like task switching, right? Is you've come from another task and it takes you several minutes or maybe more to get back into the flow of where you're at. So I love that one. I might use it myself.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for taking the time and sharing the Queenwood study. It's been phenomenal just hearing some of the insights. And I know I feel like we're only scraping the surface. So encourage our listeners to definitely go and have a read of the report because it's extensive. Fantastic. Until we chat again. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks for having me.
If you are a new listener to the podcast, make sure you share it with friends, save it, or subscribe. And if you have any questions, and we really want to hear from our listeners, if you have any questions or comments, send us a DM through either of our social media channels, which is Twitter and Instagram at ed to self-reg. As always, to you and everyone else out there, keep regulating.